The train groaned, a beast of iron and steam sighing its last breath as it shuddered to a stop. For Evelyn Hart, the sound was the closing of a door on a life she knew and the opening of one she could only imagine. She stepped from the carriage and the world became red, a fine, persistent dust, the color of rust and dried blood, swirled from the platform boards, coating the hem of her dark blue traveling dress and tasting of grit on her tongue. It was a wind with teeth, not the gentle breezes of the northeast, but a scouring force that seemed to want to peel the town of Red Mesa right off the face of the Colorado territory. She clutched her valise, its familiar weight a small anchor in this vast, raw land. The town itself was little more than a single street carved from the wilderness, a collection of raw timber buildings squinting under a sun that offered heat but no warmth. Across the way, the Golden Spur Saloon already had men lounging on its porch, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats, their eyes following her progress with a lazy, assessing curiosity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. A woman alone was a spectacle, a puzzle to be figured out. Her destination was the blacksmith shop, the letter in her reticule, penned in the strong, clear hand of a Mr. Silas Abernathy had promised a position as tutor to his 2 young boys and a small but sturdy room above the smithy. It promised a start. She walked, her boots sinking slightly into the deep dust of the street, her posture straight and her chin held high, a discipline learned from years as a junior instructor at a Boston ladies' academy. She would not show fear. The smithy was quiet. The great bellows were still. The forge cold. A wave of unease washed over her. A woman stood in the wide doorway, wiping her hands on a leather apron. She was younger than Eve had expected, with strong arms and dark, intelligent eyes that held no artifice. Evelyn cleared her throat. "Good afternoon. I am looking for Mr. Silas Abernathy. I am Miss Hart." The woman's expression softened with a flicker of something that looked like pity. "I am Marisol Alvarez," she said, her voice low and steady, with a musical lilt. "Mr. Abernathy. He passed on 3 weeks ago now." The red dust seemed to thicken in the air, choking Evelyn. Passed but his letter. It was dated only last month. Marisol nodded, her gaze direct. "Things happen fast out here. It was the water, a dispute." She gestured vaguely eastward, toward a line of cottonwoods that marked a creek, with Barrett Crow. The name meant nothing to Evelyn, but the way Marisol said it, with a flat finality, told her it was a name that mattered in Red Mesa. Her heart, which had been beating with a nervous excitement, now hammered with a cold dread. No job, no acquaintance, and her funds, carefully budgeted for the journey, were nearly exhausted. I see." Evelyn managed, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. "Thank you." She turned, her mind a frantic blank. The post office. That was the only other place she could think to go. A place of official business, of connection to the world she had left behind. Perhaps there was another letter, a clarification, a mistake. The post office was small and smelled of paper and sealing wax. As she stood at the counter, trying to compose a question for the balding clerk, the door opened behind her, letting in a swirl of dust and the scent of horses and leather. A man stepped inside, his presence filling the small space. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim and a plain cotton shirt. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, a clear, steady blue, were calm. He nodded once to the clerk. "Afternoon, Henry, picking up the freight order for that hay." "Right here, Jack," the clerk said, hoisting a small crate onto the counter. The man, Jack, placed a few coins on the wood. His gaze fell on Evelyn for a moment, not with the lingering curiosity of the saloon men, but with a quiet, observant stillness. He saw the dust on her good dress, the tightness around her mouth, the well-made but worn valise at her feet. He saw a person at the end of their rope. Evelyn found her voice. "Excuse me," she said to the clerk, I was expecting to be met by Mr. Silas Abernathy." The clerk's face fell. "Oh, dear, you must be the tutor he wrote for. Dreadful business. That a real loss for the town. I was told it was a dispute over water," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jack Sullivan, who had been about to leave, paused with his hand on the door. He did not turn, but she felt his attention. "That's the long and short of it," the clerk sighed, lowering his voice. "Barrett Crow claims the upper creek is all his. Silas argued it was common access." An argument turned ugly. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides. All this way for a ghost. For a job that had vanished before she ever arrived. The last of her savings had paid for the train ticket. She had nothing. Jack turned fully then. "You have a place to stay?" "Ma'am," he asked. His voice was quiet, a low baritone that seemed to match the steady landscape. I had not yet arranged it," she admitted, hating the tremor of vulnerability she heard in her own words. He considered her for a moment. "May O'Rourke runs a clean boarding house. It's just past the general store. I can show you." It was not a forward offer, but a practical one. She was a problem, and he was a man who seemed inclined to solve problems directly. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. As they stepped back out into the unrelenting sun, a commotion drew their attention. Down the street, by the public trough fed by the very creek they had just discussed, a small cluster of townsfolk had gathered with buckets. A man on a fine black horse rode forward, flanked by two others whose hands rested near the pistols on their hips. The man in the lead was impeccably dressed in a dark coat, his face sharp and intelligent, but his eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "This water is on Crow land," he announced, his voice carrying easily in the dry air. "The public access agreement expired. Any drawing from this stream is theft." A woman with a baby on her hip spoke up. "Our wells are nearly dry. Mr. Crow, we need this for our children." Crow smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "Your wells are your concern. My water is mine." A man in a dusty vest with a silver star pinned to it stepped forward. He looked young and earnest and deeply out of his depth. "Now, Barrett," the deputy began, "we've always shared this stream. Let's be neighborly." "Neighborly don't pay my bills, Deputy Reed," Crow said smoothly. "The law is the law, and my deeds are filed proper." He gestured with his chin, and one of his men dismounted, kicking over a woman's bucket. The water, more precious than gold in this parched land, vanished instantly into the red dust. Evelyn watched, frozen. She saw the flash of anger in the deputy's eyes, quickly suppressed by a look of weary resignation. She saw the slumped shoulders of the townsfolk as they dispersed, defeated. Off to the side, leaning against the wall of the general store, two native men watched the scene unfold with impassive faces. They were dressed in a mix of traditional buckskin and settlers' cotton shirts, their long black hair tied back. They watched not just the argument, but the creek itself, their expressions ones of ancient, knowing sorrow. Jack Sullivan made a low sound of disgust in his throat. He had not moved, had not challenged Crow, but a muscle worked in his jaw. He had seen this play before. "That's Barrett Crow," he said to Evelyn, his voice grim. "He buys up land, and then he buys up the water on it. And in Red Mesa, you own the water. You own everything else, too." He turned his gaze back to her. "Come on, let's get you to Mays." May O'Rourke was a woman built like a brick smokehouse, with a scowl that seemed permanent and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Jack's brief explanation, her gaze traveling over Evelyn from the neat bun of her hair to the scuffed toes of her boots. "Another soul drawn west by a pretty promise," she said, her voice raspy. "The West eats promises for breakfast. Room is $2 a week, in advance. Breakfast is included. Supper is extra." Evelyn's heart sank. She had $4 and some change to her name. It would not last, but for tonight, it was a roof. She paid for the week. the coins feeling impossibly light as they left her palm. Later that evening, after a solitary meal of stew in Mrs. O'Rourke's dining room, Evelyn felt a pull to return to the post office. It was a foolish hope, but she could not shake it. The clerk, Henry, was preparing to close, but recognized her and gave her a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, Miss Hart," he said. "I was thinking on it after you left. Silas had me holding his mail for a while. He sent out a whole stack of those letters. You know, looking for help." He ducked behind the counter and came back with a small bundle of letters tied with string. These were all returned. Addresses were wrong, or the folks had moved on. He handed them to her. They were identical to the one she had received. Her fingers trembled as she looked at the top one, then the next. It was not the addressees that caught her eye. It was the postmarks. They were all dated nearly 3 months ago. She pulled her own letter from her reticule, the one that had brought her across a continent. The letter itself was dated in May, but the postmark, the official stamp from the Red Mesa post office that had sent it on its way, was clearly marked August, 3 months later. Someone had deliberately held these letters. Someone had waited, ensuring that by the time any hopeful applicant arrived, Mr. Abernathy would be gone, his assets in disarray, his contract void. It was not a tragedy of circumstance. It was a plan, a cold, calculated move in a game she was only now beginning to comprehend. The goal was not just to hire cheap labor, but to ensure that labor arrived disoriented, desperate, and with no one to turn to. The blood drained from her face. She felt a profound and terrifying isolation, the sense of being a tiny, insignificant piece in a vast, cruel puzzle. The bell above the post office door jingled. Jack Sullivan stood there, a small sack of flour in his hand. He had been to the general store. He saw the bundle of letters in her hand, the stark white of her knuckles, the look of dawning horror in her eyes. He did not need to ask what was wrong. He could see that she had just learned that her bad luck was not luck at all. He set the flour sack down on the counter. The silence in the small room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a wall clock and the lonely howl of the red wind outside. Evelyn looked up at him, her carefully constructed composure shattered. She was not in a town of strangers. She was in a trap laid by a predator. Jack's expression did not change, but a new depth came into his steady blue eyes, a quiet understanding. "My ranch," he said, his voice even and low, cutting through her panic. "It's called the Sullivan Range. My books are a mess. I need someone who can read and write better than I can to sort them out. It would be temporary work. Room and board." He paused. "You would be safe there." The choice hung in the air, stark and terrifying. To flee on the next train east, with barely enough money for a ticket to the next dusty town, where she would be just as alone and just as vulnerable. Or to trust this quiet, watchful stranger, to step further into the very land that had been so cruelly prepared for her. It was a choice between a known destitution and an unknown risk. The wind rattled the window pane, throwing a fine spray of red dust against the glass. It sounded like a warning, or perhaps a challenge. The ride to the Sullivan Range was a silent one. The wagon wheels cut through the deep red dust, and the vast, open country stretched out on all sides, a landscape of raw beauty and intimidating scale. Evelyn sat straight on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, while Jack Sullivan handled the team with an economy of movement that spoke of long practice. He did not seem to feel the need to fill the silence with talk, and for that, she was grateful. Her own thoughts were a whirlwind, a chaotic mix of fear, relief, and a stubborn, stinging pride. The ranch house came into view after nearly an hour. Nestled in a shallow valley where the land was a little greener, it was a long, low building of sturdy timber and river stone. With a wide porch, it looked solid, built to withstand the elements. But as they drew closer, Evelyn saw that it lacked a certain softness. There were no flowers in the window boxes, no welcoming rocker on the porch. It was a shelter, not a home. A few ranch hands stopped their work to watch them arrive, their expressions curious but respectful. Jack reined in the horses and simply said, "We are here." Inside, the house was just as she had expected. It was clean, meticulously so. The wood floors were swept, the furniture free of dust, but it was the sterile cleanliness of a place that is merely occupied. It was cold with the absence of a woman's touch, of the small, unnecessary things that transform a house into a home. There was a lingering scent of old wood smoke and coffee, but not of baked bread or simmering stew. "Your room is this way," Jack said, leading her down a short hall. He opened a door to a small, spare room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the rolling plains. "It is not much, but the roof does not leak." "It is more than enough," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan." "Jack," he corrected her, not unkindly. He set her valise on the floor. "The ledgers are in the main room. I will let you get settled." He left, closing the door softly behind him, granting her a privacy she desperately needed. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress rustling with its straw filling. She had accepted this man's charity. The thought was a bitter pill. She was an educated woman, a teacher. She was meant to be independent. But the West had stripped her of that certainty in a single afternoon. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and dry pine. She would not be a burden. She would earn her place here. Her self-respect demanded it. The ledgers were, as Jack had promised, a mess. They were piled on a heavy oak table in the main room. A chaotic jumble of receipts skewered on a nail, cattle tallies scrawled on scraps of wood, and notebooks filled with figures that started strong and trailed off into illegibility. For the first time since arriving in Red Mesa, Evelyn felt a flicker of her old self. This was a puzzle she could solve. This was order she could create. For the next few days, she worked relentlessly. She bought new ledgers at the general store on a supply run with one of the hands. She sorted the receipts, painstakingly entering columns of figures, calculating profits and losses, tracking the cost of feed against the projected price of beef. The work was methodical and calming. As she worked, she began to see the story of the Sullivan Range, a tale of hard work, lean years, and a stubborn refusal to fail. She also began to quietly impose her own order on the house. She found the kitchen to be as Spartan as the rest of the dwelling. She started by baking a loaf of bread. The simple, wholesome scent filled the cold corners of the house, a silent announcement of her presence. The next evening, she made a thick beef stew, rich with potatoes and wild onions she had found growing near the creek. When Jack came in from the long day's work, he stopped in the doorway, his face grimy with dust, and sniffed the air. He looked at the bubbling pot on the stove, then at Evelyn, but said nothing. At supper, however, he ate 2 full bowls, and the quiet approval was more meaningful to her than a dozen compliments. She soon noticed the children. There were 3 of them, the offspring of 2 of the ranch hands who lived in small cabins closer to the bunkhouse. Diego was the oldest, a serious boy of 10. Then there was Lucy, a shy girl of 8 with wide, curious eyes, and little Ruthie, who was barely 5. They would sometimes linger near the main house, watching her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. They were bright children, but their hands were already calloused from chores, and their futures seemed to be as circumscribed as the fences of the ranch. One evening, as she sat on the porch, she called them over. She had a copy of Robinson Crusoe in her valise, one of the few personal treasures she had brought with her. "Do you children know how to read?" she asked gently. Diego shook his head, looking at his boots. "Some," he mumbled. "Mr. Sullivan's mother showed me my letters once." An idea took root, a return to the purpose that had brought her here in the first place. The next day, she approached Jack as he was mending a harness on the porch. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice formal. "The children. They have no school. I would like to offer lessons in the evenings, after my work with the ledgers is done." He looked up from the leather strap in his hands, his blue eyes studying her. He was silent for a long moment, considering. "They have chores," he said finally. "After their chores, then—" She persisted. "An hour each evening. It would be no trouble." He gave a slow nod. "All right," he said. "They would be fortunate to learn from you." And so, the main room of the Sullivan Ranch house became a makeshift schoolroom by the light of a kerosene lamp. Evelyn taught them their letters, their numbers, how to form words and shape sentences. She watched their faces light up with the magic of understanding, and in their progress, she found a sense of purpose that was wholly her own. She was not a guest, not a charity case. She was a teacher again. The first dust storm of the season arrived without warning. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, yellowish brown, and the wind began to howl, a low moan that grew into a deafening roar. The world outside the windows dissolved into a swirling vortex of red sand. It was a terrifying display of nature's power, a force that could scour the land clean. A crash of splintering wood sounded over the wind's shriek. Jack was on his feet in an instant, grabbing a heavy coat. The new calf pen he yelled over the storm. "The roof is going!" Evelyn's first instinct was to shrink away from the violent noise, to stay in the relative safety of the house. But then she thought of the young calves, vulnerable in the storm. Before she could think twice, she had grabbed a shawl and was following Jack out the door. The force of the wind was like a physical blow. It tore the breath from her lungs and flung stinging sand into her eyes. She could barely see Jack a few feet in front of her. A large section of the pen's roof had been torn loose and was flapping violently, threatening to break apart completely. "Hold this rope," Jack shouted, pressing a thick coil of hemp into her hands. "When I give the signal, pull with all your weight." He climbed onto the fence, a powerful silhouette against the red gloom, and fought his way toward the damaged roof. Evelyn dug her heels into the ground, wrapping the rope around her hands, her knuckles white. The wind tore at her, trying to rip her from her footing. She held on, her muscles screaming in protest. Now he roared. She threw all her weight backward, the rope burning her palms. Above her, she could hear Jack hammering, his movements desperate and efficient as he fought to secure the loose timbers. For what felt like an eternity, they battled the storm together, a small, defiant team against the rage of the elements. When it was over, the roof was secure, and the wind was already beginning to lessen. They stumbled back toward the house, exhausted, gasping for air, and coated head to toe in a thick layer of grit. That night, as the last of the storm blew itself out, a wagon pulled up to the house. It was Marisol Alvarez, her face smudged with soot from her own forge. She had a toolbox with her. "I figured the wind might have loosened some things," she said, her gaze taking in the repaired calf pen. "That gate looks like it took a beating." Without waiting for an invitation, she went to work, the clang of her hammer on the iron hinges a reassuring sound in the night. As she worked, Tahoma, one of the two Navajo brothers Evelyn had seen in town, appeared as if from the shadows. He had been checking on the horses in a sheltered canyon. He walked with Marisol to the creek that fed the ranch and pointed toward the waterline. "It is lower," he said, his voice quiet and grave. "The storm brings wind, but no rain. The earth is thirsty." Later, after Marisol had fixed the gate and departed, Jack found Evelyn on the porch, staring out into the star-filled, newly washed sky. "I could not have done that alone today," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you, Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her given name. The simple words of gratitude warmed her more than any fire. She was not a burden. She was a partner. A few nights later, a different kind of quiet settled over the ranch. Evelyn was working late on the ledgers, the numbers finally beginning to make sense. To tell a coherent story, a single lamp burned in the main room. She heard a floorboard creak and looked up to see Jack standing by the cold fireplace. He was holding a worn, folded letter in his hands. Believing herself unseen, she remained still. He unfolded the paper carefully and began to read aloud, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. The words were not for her, but for himself. They were words of love, of encouragement, of a mother's hopes for her son's future. His voice, usually so steady and reserved, held a note of deep, unguarded tenderness. In that moment, Evelyn saw past the stoic rancher, the capable boss, and saw the man. She saw a son who missed his mother, a man who carried his own quiet sorrows. A connection formed in that silent, shared space, a delicate thread of understanding. The next morning, the thread was violently snapped. One of the hands came running to the house before sunrise, his face pale with alarm. Jack the Trough. You need to see this. Evelyn followed Jack outside, the main water trough, a long, heavy structure that served the horses near the barn, had been vandalized. A section had been crudely hacked apart with an axe, and the precious water had drained away, leaving a dark, muddy patch on the thirsty ground. It was an act of pure waste, of calculated malice. And then she saw it, gouged into the wood beside the damage, sharp and deep, was a symbol. It was the unmistakable, jagged outline of a crow. It was not just damage. It was a message, a threat. Barrett Crow's war was no longer a distant problem in town. It had arrived at the Sullivan Range. The jagged carving of the crow was a declaration of war. Jack Sullivan stared at it, his face a mask of cold fury. He ran a hand over the splintered wood of the trough, the deliberate waste of it a deeper insult than any threat. This was not a fight he had sought, but it had come to his door. He spent the morning repairing the damage, his hammer blows echoing in the unnaturally quiet air, each strike a measured beat of his anger. But the repair could not bring back the lost water, and the level of the creek seemed to drop lower with every passing hour. The days that followed were tense. A new, harder edge settled over the ranch. Water was rationed, hauled in buckets from the dwindling creek for the household. The cattle grew restless, their lowing calls filled with a persistent thirst. The sun beat down from a mercilessly white sky, baking the red earth into a cracked mosaic. Evelyn saw the strain on every face, felt it in the grit that settled on every surface. The ledger in her hands, filled with the numbers of a thriving enterprise, felt like a history of a different, wetter time. Her mind, accustomed to finding patterns and solutions in columns of figures, turned to the problem with a teacher's logic. The Sullivan Range was not an island. To the east lay the Miller homestead, and to the south, the Garcia family's small ranch. She knew from the supply records that they, too, were struggling. They were all drawing from the same system of creeks that Barrett Crow was slowly strangling upstream. One evening, she found Jack by the corral, his gaze lost on the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple. She stood beside him, not speaking at first, simply sharing the vast, lonely silence. Then she said, "I have been studying the maps in the office, the ones your father drew." He nodded, his eyes still on the horizon. "He was a good surveyor. My father." "The creek," she continued, her voice steady. "It branches. One fork goes to the Millers, the other toward the Garcias. But the main flow is here. We have the most, but soon, the most will be nothing." "What is your point, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice weary. "My point is that we are trying to survive alone when we are all dying together. We could build a distribution trough, a central point where the 3 ranches could draw water on a schedule. We would all get less than we want, but we would all get enough to survive. If we do not share, we will all die of thirst." He turned to look at her then, his blue eyes searching her face in the fading light. He saw not the frightened Eastern woman who had arrived weeks ago, but a person of formidable resolve. "That is a direct challenge to Crow," he said flatly, "building something together, a common asset. He will see it as an alliance, and he will try to break it." "And what is he doing now?" "Jack," she countered, her voice rising with a passion she did not know she possessed. "He is breaking us one by one. First Mr. Abernathy, Now us. Who is next? The Millers. He thrives on our fear, on our isolation. Being alone is not safety. It is a slow death. He was silent for a long time. The only sound the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of a cow. He was a man who carried his burdens alone, who believed that protecting his people meant keeping them out of fights. But her logic was as unyielding as the bedrock beneath their feet. He let out a long breath. We will need to talk to the others. And we will need pipes and fittings. I will talk to Marisol, Evelyn said immediately. She will help. The next day, Jack rode to the neighboring ranches. Evelyn watched him go, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. He returned near dusk with Mr. Miller and Mr. Garcia. Their faces were grim, etched with the same worry she saw on Jack's. They gathered around the big oak table in the main room, and with the survey map spread before them. Evelyn explained her idea again. There was argument. There was doubt, but desperation was a powerful persuader. By the time they left, they had an agreement, sealed with handshakes that felt as binding as any written contract. Marisol Alvarez did not hesitate. When Evelyn explained the plan at the smithy, the formidable blacksmith nodded, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce light. He bled my friend Silas dry, she said, her voice low and dangerous. He thinks his money and his guns make him a king. I will forge you whatever you need. Valves, couplings. I will make them strong. It will be my contribution to this little revolution. A few days later, a new and unexpected ally appeared. As Jack was loading supplies in town, Deputy Tom Reed approached him, casting nervous glances down the street. I cannot be seen talking to you for long. Jack, the young deputy said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I cannot stand by and watch what he is doing. He handed Jack a thick envelope. These are copies. From the bank. Records of loans Crow has been buying up. He gets people into debt for feed or seed. Then he buys the note from the bank for pennies on the dollar. He owns half this town and they do not even know it yet. Keep these safe. They might be useful if the circuit judge ever comes through. The deputy hurried away, leaving Jack holding the evidence of a deeper, more insidious conquest than any of them had imagined. The work on the new trough system began, a quiet act of communal defiance, but the tension was a constant presence. Crow's men rode the perimeter of the Sullivan Range more frequently, their presence a silent, ongoing threat. In the midst of this escalating conflict, Evelyn clung to the small island of peace she had created in the evenings. The lessons with the children were a balm to her soul. She would light the lamp, and their eager faces would gather around the table. She told them stories of her home in Boston, of cobblestone streets and ships with tall masts in the harbor, of buildings so tall they seemed to scrape the sky. It was a world so alien to them it was like a fairy tale. Tell us again about the ocean, Eve, Lucy would ask, her eyes wide with wonder. And Evelyn would describe the vast, endless blue, the taste of salt on the wind, the roar of the waves, in their rapt attention. She found a respite from the dust and the fear. This was why they were fighting. So these children could have a future, a world bigger than this small, thirsty valley. The knowledge that Crow was actively damming the water upstream gnawed at them. It was not enough to share what was left. They had to prove he was stealing the source. Nantan, the quiet Navajo who worked for Jack, knew the high country better than any man. He had seen the dam. It is new, he told Jack one night, built of rock and cut timber. It holds back the main spring. It is a bad thing. It makes the land sick. We need to know exactly where it is, Jack said. We need to mark it, so the judge can see it. Nantan nodded. We can go at night, when the moon is new. The night they chose was black and starless. Evelyn insisted on going with them. I need to see it, she told Jack when he protested. I need to bear witness. The three of them rode out, the hooves of their horses muffled on the dusty ground. Nantan led them up into the rocky hills. Following trails that were invisible to Evelyn's eyes, the air grew cooler, the silence more profound. Finally, they dismounted, leaving the horses in a small grove of juniper. They proceeded on foot, Nantan moving with a silent grace, Jack and Evelyn picking their way carefully over the uneven ground. They heard it before they saw it, a sluggish, unnatural pooling of water. Then, in a narrow canyon, they found it. The dam was a crude, ugly scar on the land, a wall of rock and timber holding back a large pool of dark, still water. Only a trickle was allowed to escape downstream. It was a monument to one man's greed. They worked in the whispering dark, their only light a heavily shielded lantern. Jack drove white-painted stakes into the ground at intervals around the dam, marking its location, while Nantan stood watch, his senses attuned to the slightest sound. Evelyn stood as their lookout, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. They were fighting back. Suddenly, Nantan held up a hand, a sound, the faint nicker of a horse from the far side of the canyon. They froze, melting back into the shadows. They waited, every muscle tensed. But the sound did not come again. After what felt like an hour, they finished their work and retreated as silently as they had come. The white stakes stood like small ghosts in the darkness, silent accusers waiting for the dawn. They rode back to the ranch under a sky that was just beginning to turn gray in the east. They were exhausted but filled with a sense of accomplishment. They had tangible proof. They had a weapon. Their victory was short-lived. 2 nights later, Evelyn was woken by a frantic shouting. She looked out her window and her blood ran cold. An angry orange glow lit up the eastern sky. Smoke, thick and acrid, was rolling across the plains, carried on the night wind. The fire was near the creek, in a dry pasture bordering the calf pens. Men were running, their figures silhouetted against the flames, their shouts lost in the roar of the fire. The wind was fanning the blaze, driving it with terrifying speed directly toward the vulnerable young animals. Jack was already there, a wet sack in his hands, beating at the edge of the flames. Evelyn saw him through the swirling smoke, a desperate, fighting figure. The fire leapt a dry wash, and a wall of flame shot up, cutting off the main path to the pens. The calves, panicked by the smoke and heat, were crying, their calls thin and terrified. Without a thought for his own safety, Jack plunged through a gap in the flames, disappearing into the inferno to get to the animals. Evelyn screamed his name, but the fire swallowed the sound. A moment later, a section of the burning fence collapsed inward with a crash. She saw Jack stumble back, his arm raised to shield his face, his sleeve smoldering. He was hurt. The fire raged on, a hungry beast devouring the dry land, and he was trapped inside its fiery embrace with the lifeblood of the ranch. The world was a landscape of black and gray, veiled in a haze of bitter smoke. The roar of the fire had been replaced by an eerie silence, punctuated by the hiss of dying embers and the distressed calls of the cattle. Through a break in the smoke, Evelyn saw 2 ranch hands pulling Jack from the threshold of the collapsing pen, his own men beating the last of the flames from his smoldering sleeve. He was on his feet, but he swayed, his face pale beneath a mask of soot. Evelyn ran to him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She reached him at the same time as Nantan, who was already ripping away the burnt fabric of Jack's shirt. The skin beneath was an angry red, blistered and raw from his forearm to his elbow. He gritted his teeth, a muscle working in his jaw, but made no sound. "Get him to the house," Nantan said, his voice calm and authoritative. "The cattle are safe for now." Inside, by the light of a single lamp, Evelyn washed the wound as gently as she could with cool water from the basin. He sat at the oak table, his shoulders slumped with an exhaustion so profound it seemed to have settled in his bones. She worked with a focused intensity, her past life as a teacher, a woman of books and chalk dust, feeling a world away. Here, survival was a tangible, moment-to-moment thing. She found a clean linen cloth in a chest and bandaged his arm, her fingers brushing against his skin. It was a brief, impersonal contact, yet it felt charged with the night's terror and relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. He did not look at her, but stared at the wall as if he could still see the flames. "We were lucky," she said softly. "It could have been much worse." "It was not luck," he replied, his voice flat and hard. "It was a warning, the same as the trough." The next morning, the full extent of the damage was starkly visible under the rising sun. A wide, black scar was burned across the pasture land. The calf pen was a ruin of charred timbers and twisted metal. It was a sight of utter desolation. As they stood surveying the wreckage, the sound of a wagon broke the morning stillness. It was Mr. Miller, his face set in grim lines, his wagon bed loaded with fresh lumber. Another wagon followed, driven by Mr. Garcia and his two oldest sons. Then came Marisol Alvarez, her own sturdy cart carrying her tools and a load of iron fittings. "A fire on one ranch is a threat to all. Mr. Miller said, climbing down from his seat. "We are in this together. Sullivan." No one had asked them to come. No one needed to. The unspoken alliance, forged over a shared need for water, was now being tempered by fire. All day they worked, a small army of neighbors against the destruction. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the silence, a rhythm of renewal and defiance. Marisol, her face streaked with sweat and soot, worked with a furious energy, her hammer striking true, forging new hinges from the wreckage of the old. The women of the Miller and Garcia families brought food and water, turning the shared labor into a communal gathering. Evelyn worked alongside them, hauling water, fetching tools, her hands quickly becoming raw and blistered. She felt a sense of belonging she had never known, a connection born not of polite society, but of shared hardship and mutual reliance. By nightfall, a new, sturdy frame for the pen stood on the ashes of the old. It was a testament to what they could do when they stood as one. The fire and the shock had been hard on the mother cows and their calves. They needed round-the-clock care. Jack, his arm bandaged and stiff, could not do it alone. "I will take the first watch," Evelyn said that night. "You need to rest." He started to protest, but the deep lines of pain around his eyes told him it was a foolish argument. He simply nodded. "Wake me in 4 hours," he said, and retreated to his room. The barn was quiet and smelled of hay and warm milk. Evelyn sat on a stool by the light of a lantern, watching the soft breathing of the calves. This was the heart of the ranch, its future, and it was so terribly fragile. In these long, silent hours, she felt the rhythms of the land, the slow, steady pulse of life that persisted in the face of so much hardship. They fell into a routine. He would take the late watch, she the early one. They passed each other in the gray light of dawn, exchanging quiet words about which calf was restless, which mother was not giving enough milk. A new, unspoken intimacy grew between them in the shared responsibility. She saw the unguarded gentleness in his hands as he soothed a frightened animal. He saw the unflagging strength in her, a resilience that ran far deeper than her delicate appearance suggested. One afternoon, the easy rhythm was broken. One of the mother cows, a temperamental creature named Bess, was refusing to be milked. The hand assigned to the task was struggling, and the rest of the men were out mending the far fences. "I can do it," Evelyn said with a confidence she did not feel. "I have been watching. It cannot be that difficult." She approached the cow with a bucket, murmuring soft, encouraging words as she had seen Jack do. Bess eyed her with profound suspicion, her tail twitching. Evelyn sat on the small milking stool, positioned the bucket, and reached for the udder. Her first few attempts were clumsy, producing only a thin, pathetic trickle. Then she squeezed a bit too hard. Bess responded with a sudden, indignant kick. It was not a vicious blow, but it was perfectly aimed. The stool flew out from under Evelyn, and she landed in a heap in the soft, dusty hay, the empty bucket clattering beside her. She sat up, stunned and sputtering, a piece of hay stuck in her hair. From the doorway of the barn came a sound she had never heard before. Jack was laughing. It was not a small chuckle, but a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to come from his soul. It transformed his face, erasing the weary lines and making him look younger, freer. The sight of it, the sound of it, struck her more than the cow's kick. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a mixture of embarrassment and a strange, fluttering warmth. He walked over, his laughter subsiding into a wide smile. He extended his good hand to her. "Here," he said. "Bess requires a more formal introduction." She took his hand. It was warm and calloused, engulfing her own. As he pulled her to her feet, she stumbled slightly, and for a brief moment they were standing close, his face just inches from hers. The smile faded from his eyes, replaced by something else, something deeper and more serious. The air crackled with a sudden tension. Evelyn could feel the steady beat of his heart, or perhaps it was her own. Then, as if remembering themselves, they both stepped back, breaking the connection. He cleared his throat. "I will handle Bess," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. Evelyn retreated to the house, her thoughts in turmoil. What was this feeling? This confusing, unsettling flutter in her chest whenever he looked at her, whenever his hand brushed hers. She had come to Red Mesa seeking a position, a measure of independence. She had not come seeking this complicated, powerful emotion that was beginning to take root in her heart. That night, on her watch, she found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the darkness. He had not gone to bed. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and brought one out to him. "You should be sleeping," she said softly, handing him the cup. "Cannot sleep," he said, taking it. "Too much to think about." They sat in a comfortable silence for a while. In the distance, on a low hill, stood a solitary aspen tree. It had been on the edge of the fire, and its trunk was blackened, its leaves scorched away. But in the days since the fire, a miracle had occurred. Tiny new leaves, a vibrant, impossible green, were beginning to sprout from the charred branches. "It is coming back," Evelyn murmured, looking at the tree. He followed her gaze and nodded. "Aspens are tough. Their roots run deep. A fire on the surface does not kill them." He fell silent again, and Evelyn sensed he was wrestling with something more than the ranch. "My father," he said suddenly, his voice low. "He loved this land, but it broke him. There was a drought, worse than this one. The bank called in his loans. He had tied himself to this ranch, to my mother, to me. And when he failed, he felt he had failed us all. He started drinking. He was not a bad man. Evelyn, he was just broken." He looked at her then, and she saw in his eyes a deep, old pain. "I watched what it did to him. What being tied down, being responsible for everything and everyone, did to him when things went wrong. I swore I would never let that happen to me. I would run this ranch. I would be a good neighbor, but I would keep myself separate. It is safer that way." Evilly heard the unspoken fear beneath his words. His fear was not of commitment, but of failure. The fear of causing pain to those he cared about. It was the reason for his solitary existence, for the cold, empty spaces in his house. He was protecting a heart that had been wounded long ago. She did not say anything, but her listening, her quiet presence, was its own kind of answer. She understood. The moment of shared vulnerability hung between them, more profound than any touch. The little aspen on the hill stood as a testament to resilience, a symbol that new life could emerge from the deepest scars. A fragile hope began to bloom in the ashes of their hardship. The hope was shattered at dawn. Diego came running from the bunkhouse, his young face a mask of terror. "Jackie, Vim, it is one of the new calves. Come quick." They found the animal lying in the pen, its head lolling. It was shivering, and its breathing was shallow. When Jack gently opened its mouth, he recoiled as if struck. There were angry, open sores on the animal's tongue and gums. Jack's face went pale, a stark white beneath his tan. He ran a hand through his hair, his expression one of dawning horror.
"What is it?"
she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a new and terrible dread. "Hoof and mouth," he said, the words like stones. "It is a plague. It will spread through the herd like a wildfire." All their work, all their fighting, had been to save the ranch from thirst and from Barrett Crow. Now, a silent, invisible enemy was inside their fences, threatening to destroy everything from within. They needed clean water for quarantine, for survival, more desperately than ever before, but even that might not be enough. The disease was a quiet, insidious thief. It moved through the herd not with the roar of a fire, but with a silent, feverish touch. The Sullivan Range transformed into a grim infirmary under the open sky. Every day was a desperate battle fought with buckets of boiled water, clean rags, and a dwindling supply of hope. The healthy cattle were separated from the sick, a division that seemed to grow smaller each morning. The air, once filled with the content lowing of a healthy herd, was now punctuated by the weak, miserable cries of the suffering. Jack worked with a grim, silent intensity, his face carved into a mask of exhaustion. The burn on his arm was a constant, throbbing reminder of their vulnerability. He moved with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man carrying a weight far greater than his own body. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching. The ranch was his legacy, the culmination of his family's blood and sweat, and she could see it slipping through his fingers like fine, dry dust. Her days were consumed by a new, relentless routine. The kitchen became her domain, a command post in the war against the sickness. A large pot of water was always simmering on the stove. The steam clouding the windows, she sterilized everything, from feeding pails to the men's hands, with a fierce dedication. She was no longer just keeping the books. She was fighting for the very life of the ranch, her purpose as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. And then the weather turned, a final, perverse act of cruelty from a hostile land. The temperature plummeted overnight. The relentless sun vanished behind a ceiling of bruised, gray clouds. A cold, biting wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the first stinging pellets of ice. By midday, it was snowing. Not the gentle, blanketing snow of a New England winter, but a hard, driving blizzard that seemed intent on burying the world in a shroud of ghostly white. It was an unholy baptism, a treacherous coat of beauty on a landscape of despair. The blizzard raged for a day, then another. The world shrank to the confines of the ranch house and the barns, the paths between them treacherous tunnels through the howling white. The sickest calves, already weakened by fever, began to shiver violently in the unnatural cold. "We have to keep them warm," Jack said, his voice rough with fatigue. "If the cold takes them, the fever will not have to—" The small room off the kitchen, warmed by the constant fire in the stove, became a makeshift nursery for the most critical cases. It was Evelyn's station. She laid down a thick bed of clean straw, and they brought in the 3 weakest calves, their small bodies trembling, their eyes dull with misery. She spent the long hours of the day and night boiling water for sterilization and preparing thin mashes of bran and warm milk, trying to coax the little creatures to eat. She decided to sleep there, on a narrow cot, to be close to the fire and the animals. She could not bear the thought of one of them slipping away while she slept warm in her bed. The old house groaned under the assault of the wind. It was a constant, mournful sound, the cry of old timbers being strained to their limit. The wind found every crack, every loose board, and a knife-sharp draft cut through her small room, chilling her to the bone despite the proximity of the stove. She piled her one thin blanket and her shawl on the cot, but it was not enough. The cold was relentless, seeping into her, making her teeth chatter. She knew there was a larger stack of thick wool blankets in the main storage chest, which was kept in Jack's room. It was the largest room in the house, the original cabin around which the rest had been built. and it served as his bedroom and private office. She hesitated. It was late, well past midnight. He would be asleep, but the cold was more than an inconvenience. It was a physical ache, and she knew she could not last the night without more warmth. Clutching her own meager blankets to her chest, she slipped out of the nursery. The main room was dark and freezing. The fire in the great stone hearth had burned down to glowing embers. She padded silently down the short hall, her stockinged feet making no sound on the wooden floor. His door was slightly ajar, a habit he had picked up since the fire, a way of listening for trouble in the night. She pushed it open gently. A low fire in his own small fireplace cast a flickering, golden light across the room. She could see the dark shape of him in the bed, a still mound under a heavy quilt. The large wooden chest was at the foot of his bed. She crept toward it, her movements slow and careful, feeling like a thief in the night. She reached the chest, her fingers fumbling for the latch. As she lifted the heavy lid, a sudden, violent gust of wind hit the side of the house with the force of a battering ram. The whole structure shuddered. The loose floorboard she was standing on shifted, and her foot slipped. She lost her balance, stumbling forward with a small, startled cry. The blankets in her arms tumbled from her grasp, and one of them, a thick woolen quilt, unfurled in the air and landed directly across the bed where Jack lay. He was sitting up in an instant, not with alarm, but with the quiet, immediate alertness of a man accustomed to waking in the dark. The firelight caught the tired lines of his face, the concern in his eyes. He looked at the blanket lying across his legs, then at her, standing there in her nightdress, shivering, her face a portrait of utter mortification. "I am so sorry," she stammered, her cheeks burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "The wind. I needed another blanket. I am so sorry to have woken you." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just her embarrassment, but the deep, blue shadows of exhaustion under her eyes, the way she was hugging herself against a cold that was both inside and out. His expression softened. All the harshness, all the worry, seemed to melt away, replaced by a tenderness so profound it made her breath catch in her throat. He spoke, his voice a low, gentle rumble in the quiet room. "Then sleep here, sweetheart." The words hung in the air between them, impossibly gentle. For a dizzying moment, her heart hammered against her ribs, before she could even form a thought, a protest. He spoke again, his voice calm and reassuring, already swinging his legs out of the bed. "The door is open. I will take the bench by the fire. You need to be warm and safe." He stood up, pulling on his trousers, and took the heavy quilt from the bed, the one he had been using. He draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled faintly of wood smoke and him. He guided her to the bed, his touch on her elbow light and respectful. "Sleep, Evelyn," he said. "I will keep the fire going." He settled onto the hard wooden bench near the hearth, his back to her, a silent, solitary guardian. Evelyn lay down, pulling the covers up to her chin. The bed was warm from his body, and for the first time in days, the deep, aching chill began to recede from her bones. She listened to the howl of the wind outside and the steady, quiet breathing of the man by the fire. In that moment, she understood something profound. The warmth she felt was not just the absence of cold. It was the feeling of being protected, of being cared for. It was trust. It was the solid, unshakable presence of a good man who put her safety before his own comfort without a moment's thought. This was a different kind of warmth than she had ever imagined, deeper and more enduring than the fleeting heat of passion. It was the warmth of a home. Across the room, Jack stared into the flames, listening to the storm. The feel of her presence in his room, in his bed, had not been unsettling. It had felt right since her arrival. The cold, empty spaces of his house had slowly begun to fill with life, with the scent of baking bread, with the sound of children learning, with her quiet, steady strength. He had spent years keeping himself separate, holding himself back, terrified of repeating his father's failures. But in that moment, sitting on a hard bench in the middle of a blizzard, he realized the hollowness of his own safety. He did not just want to save his ranch. He wanted a life. He wanted a real home, filled with the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with a fire. A thin, weak cry came from the nursery down the hall. It broke the spell. Jack was on his feet in an instant, and Evelyn sat up in the bed. They looked at each other across the room, their shared vigil unspoken. Together, they went to the small, shivering calf. They spent the rest of the dark hours as a team. They heated bricks in the fire, wrapped them in old sacks, and placed them around the weakest animals, creating small islands of life-saving warmth. They worked in a quiet, efficient rhythm, their movements synchronized, their purpose singular. They were two people fighting back the darkness, together. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, the blizzard had broken. The wind had died, and the world outside was a pristine, silent landscape of deep snow under a clearing sky. The battle was not over, but in the nursery, a small miracle had occurred. Two of the calves were standing on wobbly legs, and a third was finally drinking a little milk. They had survived the night. They stood together in the doorway, exhausted but buoyed by a fragile sense of victory. The rising sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning. The peace was shattered by the sound of a lone horseman, his approach muffled by the deep snow. It was Deputy Tom Reed. He rode up to the porch, his face grim, avoiding their eyes. He held out a folded piece of paper. "I am sorry, Jack," he said, his voice low. "I have to serve this." Jack took the paper and unfolded it. Evelyn read it over his shoulder. It was a legal notice. Barrett Crow had filed a formal complaint with the territorial court. He was suing for sole ownership of the water rights to the entire creek system. And he was petitioning the court for an immediate injunction to have their shared community trough dismantled and confiscated as illegal property. A circuit judge was scheduled to arrive in Red Mesa to hear the case. The date was set for 10 days from now, the day of the trial. A fierce red wind scoured Red Mesa, whipping dust through the bat-wing doors of the Golden Spurs Saloon. The saloon had been commandeered as a makeshift courtroom, its tables pushed against the walls to make space, the air thick with the smell of stale whiskey, sawdust, and nervous sweat. At a long table set at the front sat Judge Elias Thorne, a circuit judge with a face like carved granite and eyes that seemed to have already seen and judged every sin known to man. Barrett Crow sat at a table to the right, flanked by his lawyer, a slick man from Denver with a vested suit and a condescending smile. Crow himself was the picture of calm, confident authority, his hands resting on the table, his gaze sweeping over the assembled townsfolk with a look of proprietary disdain. Behind him, two of his gunmen stood against the wall, their presence a silent, looming threat. On the other side sat Jack Sullivan, with Evelyn beside him. He was not wearing the dusty clothes of a rancher, but a clean shirt and his best coat, a gesture of respect for the law he hoped would save them. Mr. Miller and Mr. Garcia sat behind him, their faces tight with anxiety. Marisol was there, as was Mrs. May, and even Tahoma and Nantan stood quietly at the back, their expressions unreadable. Judge Thorne banged a gavel on the table, the sharp crack cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. The trial began. Crow's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced. He laid out a case built on a fortress of paper. He produced deeds with official seals, outlining the land Crow had legally purchased. He presented geological surveys, paid for by Crow, which argued that the spring feeding the creek originated solely on Crow's property. He painted a picture of Jack Sullivan and his neighbors as common thieves, illegally tapping into a resource that belonged to his client. Then he delivered what he clearly believed was the final, unassailable blow. He produced a thick sheaf of promissory notes from the Red Mesa Bank. Your Honor, these documents show that Mr. Miller and Mr. Garcia are significantly in debt to the bank. My client, Mr. Crow, as a concerned citizen and the bank's largest investor, has recently acquired these notes. He is prepared to forgive these debts entirely, in the interest of neighborly harmony. If this illegal community trough is dismantled and his property rights are respected. A gasp went through the room. It was not a generous offer. It was blackmail, plain and simple. Give up the water, or lose your homes. The judge's face remained impassive, but he studied the documents with a neutral, legal eye. They appeared to be in perfect order. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he rose slowly to his feet. He did not look at Crow. He addressed the judge. Your Honor, I am not a lawyer. I am a rancher. My father ranched this land before me. He taught me that you can own land, but you cannot own the rain that falls on it, or the sun that shines on it. That water has been shared by everyone in this valley since the first settlers came here. It was shared before any of us were here. A piece of paper does not change what is right. We built that trough to survive a drought. We built it so that all of us, together, would have a chance. That is not theft. That is community. He sat down. His words were simple, but they resonated with a truth that every person in the room understood in their bones. Marisol Alvarez was called next. She walked to the front, not with a document, but with a heavy, intricate piece of forged ironwork in her hands. This is a three-way valve, she said, her voice clear and strong. I designed and built it myself. It is meant for the trough. It allows for the fair and equal distribution of the water. On a timed rotation. We are not stealing. Your Honor, we are engineering a solution. We are trying to be fair in a way Mr. Crow does not seem to understand. She placed the valve on the judge's table with a solid, metallic thud. It was a tangible piece of evidence, a testament to their intent. Next, Tahoma stepped forward. He held no paper, no object. He spoke in a quiet, melodic voice, and his words painted a different kind of picture. You speak of deeds and lines on a map, he said to the judge. My people have a different map. It is a map of memory. We have seen this creek in flood, and we have seen it when it is only a whisper of damp sand. We know that the water does not come from one spring. It is fed by the snow melt from the high mountains, by the deep earth, by the summer rains. It is a gift to the whole valley. To block it in one place is to make the whole land sick. The land does not belong to a man. The man belongs to the land. Crow's lawyer smirked, but Judge Thorne listened, his expression thoughtful. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the West, and he understood that there was a wisdom here that was older than any territorial court. Evelyn was the next to be called. She walked to the front, her heart pounding, carrying the ledger she had so meticulously kept. Your Honor, she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. Since the trouble began, I have kept a daily journal of the creek's water level, measured at the same time, at the same spot, every morning. She opened the book, showing the neat columns of dates and measurements. As you can see, the flow was consistent until this date, when it dropped by half overnight. And on this date, after a heavy rain in the mountains, the creek barely rose at all. This is not the pattern of a natural drought. This is the pattern of a man-made obstruction. She felt Crow's cold stare on her, but she did not look at him. She looked at the judge. And then the room fell silent as Deputy Tom Reed pushed himself to his feet, his face pale and slick with sweat. I have something to say, he said, his voice cracking. Crow turned in his chair, a look of pure menace on his face. The deputy flinched but held his ground. What Mr. Crow's lawyer said about those banknotes is not the whole truth, he stammered, his eyes fixed on the judge. Mr. Crow did not just buy those notes. He arranged them. He told the bank manager which farmers to extend credit to and which to deny. He had me deliver notices telling folks they had to use his freight company for their supplies, at higher prices, driving them deeper into debt. He was setting a trap. He was not just trying to get the water. He was trying to get their land, their lives. He offered me money to look the other way. I took it. He threatened my family if I spoke up. I was a coward, but I will not be a coward anymore. The confession hung in the air, a stunning admission of the corruption that had been poisoning the town. Crow's lawyer jumped to his feet, shouting about unsubstantiated claims and a coerced witness. But the judge silenced him with a single look. Judge Thorne looked at the banknotes, then back at the pale but resolute deputy. He seemed to be weighing the letter of the law against the spirit of justice. He looked at Jack, then at Crow. It was Crow who had the legal documents. The signed papers, the proof of debt. The judge's expression was grim. It seemed the weight of the paper might be too much to overcome. It was in that moment of fragile balance that Evelyn knew it was time. She stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with a new and unshakable authority. "There is one more piece of evidence you must see." She walked to the table and placed the small, string-tied bundle of letters before him. "My employment here was to be with Mr. Silas Abernathy, the former blacksmith, whose death was also the result of a water dispute with Mr. Crow. This is the letter of employment I received from him." She laid her own letter out, then untied the bundle. "These are the other letters Mr. Abernathy sent out, which were returned to the post office." She pointed a steady finger. "Your Honor, please note the date Mr. Abernathy wrote on my letter. It says May the 10th. Now, please note the dates on these other letters. They are all from the same week in May." The judge leaned forward, studying the papers. "Now," she said, her voice dropping, drawing everyone in, "please look at the official postmark. The mark that shows when the letter was actually sent from the Red Mesa post office." The judge picked up the letter, his eyes narrowing. "This postmark says August the 14th, he said, his voice low with dawning realization. Nearly 3 months later. Evelyn looked directly at the jury of townsfolk, and then at the judge. Someone deliberately held those letters. Someone with influence in this town ensured that no help would arrive for Mr. Abernathy in time. Someone made sure that when I, or anyone else, finally did arrive, we would find our prospective employer dead and our own situation desperate. It was a plan to create a pool of desperate people, indebted and controllable. It is the same plan he used with the ranchers and their loans. It shows a pattern of deliberate, predatory fraud. A wave of understanding, of collective shock and anger, swept through the room. This was the final piece, the key that unlocked the entire conspiracy. It was not about water. It was about absolute power, achieved through deceit. Barrett Crow was on his feet, his face a thunderous mask of rage. "This is an outrage, a fabrication." "Sit down, Mr. Crow," the judge commanded, his voice like the crack of a whip. Judge Thorne stood, his full height seeming to dominate the room. He looked at the evidence before him. The deeds, the banknotes, the scientific journal, the hand-forged valve, and the damning, delayed letters. "The law is a tool," he said, his voice echoing in the silent saloon. "It can be used to build, or it can be used as a weapon. This court has seen today how it can be twisted to serve one man's greed. Therefore, I rule as follows." The room held its breath. "First, the dam constructed by Mr. Crow on the Upper Creek is an illegal obstruction of a public waterway and must be dismantled immediately. Second, the community trough is a legal and legitimate solution to a shared crisis and may remain. And third, all banknotes for Mr. Miller, Mr. Garcia, and any others involved in this scheme, which were fraudulently acquired by Mr. Crow, are hereby declared null and void." A collective sigh of relief, then a rising murmur of joyous disbelief, filled the room. It was over. They had won. Jack looked at Evelyn, his eyes shining with a gratitude and admiration so profound it made her heart ache. Crow said nothing. He simply stared at the judge, his face a pale, chilling mask of hatred. He turned, and with his lawyer and gunman trailing in his wake, he strode from the saloon without a backward glance. As he passed Jack, he leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. "This is not over. Sullivan, you will regret this day." The threat was a sliver of ice in the warm glow of their victory. But for now, they had won. The law had prevailed. That night, a celebration, quiet but deeply felt, took place at the Sullivan Range. The neighbors were there, their faces full of a hope they had not felt in months. But as the last of the guests departed and a weary peace settled over the valley, a single, sharp crack echoed from the foothills. It was the sound of a rifle shot, sharp and clear in the cold night air, a sound that promised that Barrett Crow was a man who kept his word. The single gunshot was followed by a terrifying silence, and then by a volley. The sharp cracks were not aimed at the house, but at the newly rebuilt barn and the calf pens, a wild, indiscriminate fusillade in the dark, splintering wood, the panicked bellowing of cattle, the high, terrified whinny of horses. It was not an attack meant to kill, but to terrorize, to shatter the fragile peace they had won, to undo the work of their hands with senseless violence. Jack was moving before the second shot echoed away. Grabbing the rifle he kept mounted over the fireplace. "Get the children away from the windows," he yelled to Evelyn. "Stay in the kitchen." But Evelyn's immediate thought was of Deputy Tom Reed. He had ridden out an hour after the celebration, worried about Crow's simmering rage, and had decided to make a quiet patrol around the ranch's perimeter before heading back to town. He was out there, somewhere in the dark. The shooting intensified, punctuated by the drunken whoops of Crow's men. It was chaos and malice unleashed. Through the kitchen window, Evelyn saw muzzle flashes from the low ridge overlooking the pens. Suddenly, a lantern in the hands of one of the ranch hands was shot from his grasp, plunging a section of the yard into darkness. Then she saw him. Tom Reed, his horse shot from under him, was scrambling on foot. He was not running for cover, but toward the small bunkhouse cabin where the children of the ranch hands slept. A stray bullet tore through the cabin's thin wall, and a child's scream of terror pierced the night. Without a second of hesitation, Tom threw himself against the cabin's door, pushing it open and shoving the children inside toward the floor, shielding them with his own body as another splintering crash echoed from the wood beside his head. Jack, using the corner of the house as cover, fired a single, carefully aimed shot toward one of the muzzle flashes. A man cried out in pain, and the shooting from that position stopped, but there were at least two others. Just as the situation felt its most desperate, more gunshots answered from the east, from the direction of the Millers' homestead, and then from the south, from the Garcias, the sound of approaching horses. Not just 2 or 3, but a half-dozen, joined the fray. The community, bound by water and fire, was now bound by a shared defense. They were not letting the Sullivan Range stand alone. The ambushers, realizing they were no longer shooting at a single, isolated ranch but were facing an armed and determined neighborhood, faltered. Their wild shooting became a few panicked, parting shots before they scrambled for their horses. Evelyn watched from the window as 2 figures rode away frantically into the darkness. Further up the ridge, a third figure on a fine black horse, who had been watching the chaos from a distance, turned to flee. It was Barrett Crow. He did not ride toward town, but spurred his horse west, out into the vast, open plains, a lone rider against the immense, dark horizon. As he disappeared, the wind began to rise again, a low, ominous moan that promised another storm. "Tom," he yelled. "Tom, are you all right?" There was no answer. Jack pushed the door open. The children, Diego, Lucy, and Ruthie, were huddled together in a corner, crying but unharmed. Deputy Tom Reed lay on the floor just inside the doorway, a dark, spreading stain on his shoulder. He was carried into the main house and laid on the long oak table that had served as a courtroom and a school desk. His face was pale and beaded with sweat, his breathing shallow. Evelyn, Her hand steady despite the tremor in her heart. Cut away his shirt. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder. It was a serious wound, bleeding freely, but if they could stop the bleeding and prevent a fever, he would live.